Welcome to the Word for Life podcast, a daily devotional covering the entire Bible from Genesis to Revelation.
In Leviticus chapter 20, we read about the various punishments for the sins that were listed in chapter 18. Friends, today we live in a time where we emphasize rehabilitation and restoration. But in this chapter, we see people who commit crimes being punished, sometimes severely with even death. For example, verse 2 says, any Israelite or any foreigner residing in Israel who sacrifices any of his children to Molech is to be put to death. The members of the community are to stone him. Now, as New Testament believers, we need to realize that these laws and punishments were handed down to Israel and not to us. Israel at that time was an independent state, and it had the power to enforce these punishments. But today, we live in a pluralistic society. Christians do not hold absolute power. Not only that, Leviticus 20 cannot be forced upon everyone in our world. This then leads us to ask what these punishments teach us, even though we are not expected to enforce it in our society. First of all, these punishments call our attention to the seriousness of sin. Today, we tend to underplay the seriousness of sin. We call darkness light and light as darkness. But believers realize that sin is serious. Sin breaks families, destroys children, and ultimately breaks down society. So, through these punishments in this chapter, believers realize the seriousness of sin. Sin has serious consequences for personal and community life. Therefore, these punishments serve as a deterrent to all those who take sin lightly. Secondly, God is important. You see, most believers claim that God is important, yet they may live lives that are displeasing to God. This chapter repeats the idea that God is the center of Israel. If Israel considers God to be so important, then they need to please Him in every way. Believers take God seriously and therefore avoid sins that are displeasing to Him. Thirdly, holiness needs to be actively practiced. It is surprising that the sins listed here are punished rather than forgiven. This means Israel must not try these sins and then come to the altar for forgiveness. In fact, Israel must stay away from these practices altogether. Israel must run away from these ungodly practices. They must practice holiness. They must separate themselves from ungodly people who promote these practices. As verse 7 tells us, consecrate yourselves and be holy, because I am the Lord your God. Fourthly, these punishments tell us that God's people must take God's wrath seriously. You see, God's wrath may be delayed, but it exists for sure. God will certainly judge. For example, in verse 3, God says, I myself will set my face against him and will cut him off from his people. For by sacrificing his children to Molech, he has defiled my sanctuary and profaned my holy name. Friends, believers can be tempted to overemphasize the goodness and grace of God over against God's wrath. As with Scripture in general, the severity of God and the mercy of God must be kept in the right balance. Fifthly, the one thing that stands out in this chapter is that Israel must be careful about sins done against other humans. You see, too often God's people can take sins against God seriously, but not sins against other human beings so seriously. In this chapter, except necromancy in verse 6, every other offense listed in this chapter is about actions done regarding other humans. Friends, believers not only take relationship with God seriously, but also their relationship with other people seriously. One can be very pious in the things of God, but not careful in doing the right thing with regard to other human beings. For example, verse 9 in this chapter says, anyone who curses their father or mother is to be put to death because they have cursed their father or mother. Their blood will be on their own head. You see, transgressions against God is not the only transgression. Transgressions against other human beings should also be taken seriously. Finally, Israel in this chapter is called to practice separation from other people. You see, in many areas, other people do not practice God's laws, and therefore, verse 23 says, you must not live according to the customs of the nations I am going to drive out before you. Because they did all these things, I abhorred them. Friends, today believers show wisdom and discernment as they move among other cultures and people. This chapter encourages holiness, and holiness sometimes requires a costly sacrifice. It may even require that we separate ourselves from certain practices and even people who are very near and dear to us.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you tomorrow for the next episode of the Word for Life podcast.